Sadiq Kahn is the current mayor of London. He has a lot of control, and he is saying that he plans to bring in rent control throughout London. This is an abysmal idea, so I had to shoot a video to talk about what rent control is and plead with the mayor of London to change his mind and to stop deceiving people, because I think that he knows it's a terrible idea, and I think that he's just saying that to try and get votes for the new election that's happening in May. So let me inform you and educate you what rent control is, and I would highly suggest that we make a stand against stupid ideas like rent control. Rent control, for anyone that doesn't know, is basically when you cap rents. Now, it sounds wonderful. It sounds great. It sounds, with the way the media talk about it, it sounds like, oh, that's a good idea, because what they say is the whole media are anti-landlord. They're anti-landlord, they're anti-rich people. Okay, no problem. But what they say is they say that rent control means that landlords can't put their rents too high and take advantage of tenants. Now, as a tenant myself, okay, I'm a tenant. I'm also a landlord. I'm also someone that's well researched and understands a little bit about history and economics. From every which angle, no matter which way I look at this, I say it's an absolutely crazy, ludicrous, retarded thing to do. And pretty much every economist would agree with me on this, whether they're left, whether they're right, they would agree that rent control is a bad idea for everybody, and it will devastate London if it happens, like it did New York. I mean, why don't we just look at history? I'm pretty sure Sadiq knows this. Now, this is what Sadiq said. He said that the arguments for rent control are overwhelming. What are they? What are the arguments? Name them to me. How are they overwhelming? What's the argument for rent control? Besides playing on emotions and sensational stories about poor people that couldn't quite afford their rent and choosing one cap. But what are the arguments? Help me out, Sadiq. And then he says, and Londoners overwhelmingly want it to happen. The reason Londoners overwhelmingly want it to happen is because they don't understand the effects. Let me explain, okay? Rent control, let's say that they cap rents at a certain amount. And they say you can't rent somewhere for more than 5 grand, all right? And what's gonna happen? Well, all the people that want to pay more than 5 grand, like me, I rent my house, I pay £7,500 a month. If they said you can't pay more than £7,500 a month, then I would then be forced as a tenant to be like, oh, well, I have to find somewhere cheaper then. I'm not just gonna get my house cheaper, it's gonna be pulled from the market. So me as a tenant that wants to pay a really high rent because I want a nice place, it's gonna take very expensive tenants that want very expensive rents, and it's gonna force them to have to rent somewhere more affordable, more cheaper, which is gonna do what? Which is gonna mean more competition with the tenants that can only afford it. So people like me, who am pretty rich, I'm gonna be now taking houses, because I'm queuing up to rent houses that are more affordable, taking affordable houses, it's gonna reduce the amount of properties on the market. And there'll be less affordable accommodation. I mean, that's the first reason straight away. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, this whole idea of greedy landlords is not true anyway. I would argue that a greedy landlord doesn't really exist, because if you're a greedy landlord and you go, I'm gonna hike my rents up, what's gonna happen is you're gonna push your rents up and you're gonna have an empty property. No one's gonna pay it if you're trying to charge too much. People are just gonna go, I'm not gonna pay. Right? It's a free market. So if you put your rents really high and the house isn't worth it, people are just gonna not rent it. The only way people are gonna rent it when you put the rent high is if it's worth it. So the idea of rent control is anti a free market. It's terrible. Number two, second reason, and there's a whole bunch of reasons, second reason why rent control is a terrible idea is because investors, at the moment there's a lot of investors that are investing into London. They're buying apartments, they're buying affordable property, and they're buying luxury property and everything in between, and they're renting those properties out. They're buying it as an investment. If rent control is a thing in London, it's going to mean that all investors will not want to buy in London anymore. And investors, like me, are going to start buying in other areas. Investors from Hong Kong and China and London aren't going to want to buy properties to rent them out anymore in London. So they're going to go to other areas. So what's that going to mean for London? It's going to mean that there's less supply. There's not as much supply anymore. And when there's not as much supply anymore, what does that mean? It means it's going to push the prices up, but then there's rent control. So it's just ludicrous. It's going to mean that there's queues and queues, like in New York, like in Los Angeles. There's going to be queues and queues of people wanting to rent, but there won't be any accommodation. There won't be any accommodation anymore. There won't be anywhere to rent. Because the government have stepped in with some stupid rule and tried to cap rents unnecessarily. Houses cannot become more affordable unless they become more available. And the whole concept of rent control, trying to cap the rents, is trying to provide more affordable accommodation. But it actually has the opposite effect. Thirdly, developers. Do you think that developers are going to want to come and build accommodation, apartments, houses in an area whereby they know once they've built them, the rent is capped? And the answer is no. And we've got a massive shortage. Sadiq, you're behind. Massively behind on houses that need to be built in London. So why are you trying to bring in rent control, which is they're going to put off potential developers coming into the area? Because if a developer does come into the area, which they probably wouldn't, they're going to either be building, because they know the rent control, they're going to be building really crappy little apartments because they think, oh well, the rent's going to be capped anyway. So it's just going to bring a whole bunch of nasty, crummy apartments into London, which is gonna not help with lots of things like the crimes and all sorts. Or they're gonna build really high-end luxury apartments to sell to rich people. Rent control will make the rich richer, poor poorer, bigger divide, opposite of what you say you're trying to do. And I think you know this, Sadiq. I think you're doing it just for votes. Surely before you announced that there's so many arguments for rent control, surely before you pledged if you're re-elected as mayor, you're going to bring in rent control, surely you should have looked at what happened in New York and what happened in Los Angeles when it happened. I mean, in New York, there was instances where when rent control came in, tenants were paying a third of what they should have been paying, and they just said, oh, well, I'm paying a third of what I should be paying, and they refused to leave. They just stayed there for 25 years. And then the landlords get upset, so the landlords say, well, I need to make a profit, so what do? Well, the landlords just say, well, I'm not fixing anything in the property then. I'm not going to maintain it. Forget it. You're paying such a cheap rent. If I'm being forced to not be able to charge more, you're taking advantage. And it just creates this nasty friction where you end up with houses, the tenants can't afford to fix the houses, and the landlords refuse. And in New York, you've got all these awful situations with properties getting run down. It distorts the market. We need a free market. A free market will always lead to a win-win in business. Because business is when you have a willing buyer and a willing seller. A willing tenant that wants to pay the rent and a willing landlord that charges the rent that he thinks is worth. Supply and demand. It's fair, it's nice. When the government try and step in and force capped rents and things like that, it always brings devastation, always. I went to New York. I went to New York to do a financial freedom challenge, and guess what? Within about 2 days, I realized this ain't gonna happen. The whole housing economy in New York is so distorted and strange, and there's loads of people on the streets. Why is there such a massive homeless problem in New York? Maybe it's because there's no properties to rent, affordable properties, because they brought in rent caps, which actually means that there's no properties to rent at all, because it completely ruins the whole market. We need a free market. So listen, don't just take my word for it. Go and do your research on rent control, and then ask Sadiq Kahn, what are all these overwhelming arguments for rent control? Because I can't find any. Ask him the question. And I would say, please don't vote for Sadiq. If you live in London, I like Brian Rose. I like his policies, I like Brian Rose. Or Sean Bailey. Anyone but Sadiq. Hashtag get Sadiq out. Study rent control. I'll be doing more videos. I'll be keeping you posted on exactly what's happening in London, on exactly what's happening with the housing market. So subscribe to my channel for more updates. If you like my videos, smash the like button, but please don't vote for Sadiq.